My name is Elena Rodriguez. I am 58 years old. I was once a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, decorated for valor in 3 combat zones. But no one tells you that the hardest war you'll ever fight isn't against an enemy with guns and grenades. It's against the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally when they decide you're too broken to deserve that love anymore. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. I wasn't always the woman my family whispers about in hushed, embarrassed tones. I used to stand at attention while generals pinned medals to my chest. I commanded respect from soldiers who would follow me into hell if I asked them to. I carried myself with the kind of quiet authority that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're worth. But that was before Afghanistan changed everything. Before my own blood decided I was damaged goods. The woman you see now, the one they call unstable and dangerous, once led a battalion of 400 soldiers through some of the most hostile territory on Earth. I made split-second decisions that saved lives. I wrote letters to grieving families with hands that never trembled, even when my heart was shattering. I stood in formation while artillery shells screamed overhead, my voice steady as I gave orders that would bring everyone home alive. But all of that meant nothing when I came back stateside and couldn't sleep through a thunderstorm without diving for cover. When I flinched every time a door slammed too hard. When I scanned every room for exits and threats that existed only in my mind. My family didn't see a decorated officer struggling with invisible wounds. They saw a ticking time bomb that needed to be defused before it exploded and embarrassed them all. It started innocently enough, the way these things always do. Little comments about how I seem different, more jumpy, suggestions that maybe I should talk to someone, get some help. But the tone underneath those words was what cut the deepest. It wasn't a concern, it was fear. Fear of me. Fear of what I might do. Fear of what the neighbors might think if they found out their decorated war hero was falling apart at the seams. My sister Maria was the first to use the word that would haunt me for years to come. Crazy. She said it quietly at first, to our mother when she thought I couldn't hear, then louder, to anyone who would listen. My brother Carlos joined the chorus soon after, telling his wife that I wasn't safe to be around their children, that something about my eyes looked hollow, dangerous, like I might snap at any moment and hurt someone innocent. The truth was, I was hurting. Every single day felt like walking through a minefield of memories that could detonate without warning. The sound of helicopters overhead sent me scrambling for non-existent cover. Crowds made my chest tighten until I couldn't breathe. But I never hurt anyone except myself. I never raised my voice, never lost my temper, never gave them any real reason to fear me. Yet somehow, I became the family ghost story. The cautionary tale they told in whispers. When my nephew graduated high school, I wasn't invited to the party. When my niece got married, my invitation mysteriously got lost in the mail. Birthdays, holidays, family gatherings I had once helped organize and host suddenly happened without me. I would drive by my mother's house and see all their cars in the driveway, knowing they were inside, sharing meals and laughter while I sat alone in my apartment, wondering what I had done to deserve exile from the people who were supposed to love me most. The final blow came 3 years ago, at what was supposed to be a reconciliation dinner. My mother had called, said the family missed me, that it was time to put the past behind us and come together. I dressed carefully that night, choosing my most conservative outfit, practicing normal conversation topics in the mirror. I wanted so badly to belong again, to prove that I wasn't the monster they had made me out to be. But the dinner was an intervention in disguise. They had researched psychiatric facilities, printed out brochures for long-term treatment centers. They sat me down at the table where I had once carved Thanksgiving turkeys and birthday cakes, and told me I needed serious help, professional help. The kind that required being committed somewhere safe, where I couldn't hurt myself or others. They spoke about me like I wasn't sitting right there, discussing my mental state with the clinical detachment of doctors reviewing a particularly troublesome case. I listened to them describe someone I didn't recognize, a volatile, unpredictable woman who might become violent at any moment. They talked about incidents that had never happened, conversations where I had supposedly threatened people, episodes of rage that existed only in their collective imagination. When I tried to defend myself, to explain that I was managing my symptoms with therapy and medication, they exchanged knowing looks. The kind that said, "See? This is exactly what we're talking about. She doesn't even realize how sick she is." My own mother looked me in the eye and said the words that shattered whatever was left of my heart. "Elena, we love you, but we can't help you anymore. You need more than we can give. You need to be somewhere safe, with people who understand how to deal with someone like you. Someone like you." As if I had become a different species entirely. As if 23 years of military service and a lifetime of putting family first meant nothing compared to a diagnosis written in my medical file. I left that night and never went back. I stopped calling, stopped trying to explain myself, stopped hoping they would remember who I used to be before the war changed me. I let them write me off as the crazy one, the family member who was too dangerous to include in their perfect suburban lives. It was easier than fighting a battle I could never win. But I survived. I found ways to manage the nightmares and the hypervigilance. I built a small but meaningful life for myself, working with other veterans who understood what it meant to come home to a world that no longer recognized them. I learned to carry my wounds with dignity, to honor both the woman I had been and the woman I was becoming. What I never expected was to find myself standing in the receiving line at my cousin's wedding reception, shaking hands with a federal judge who would look at me with recognition and respect, and change everything with 2 simple words. What I never imagined was that the same family who had called me crazy, who had written me off as damaged beyond repair, would witness a moment that would force them to confront the truth they had spent years trying to deny. I am Elena Rodriguez. I served my country with honor and distinction. I survived war zones and family rejection with equal measure. And I am about to show them all exactly who I really am, and who I have always been, beneath the scars they were too afraid to understand. I joined the United States Army when I was 19 years old, not because I had nowhere else to go, but because I had found exactly where I belonged. While my high school classmates were stumbling through college parties and changing majors every semester, I was learning to march in perfect formation, to strip and reassemble an M16 in complete darkness, to lead by example rather than by volume. The discipline spoke to something deep inside me that civilian life had never touched. There was clarity in the structure, purpose in the hierarchy, meaning in every polished button and razor-sharp crease. When you put on that uniform, you weren't just Elena Rodriguez from East Los Angeles anymore. You were part of something larger. Something that mattered, something that would test every fiber of your being and forge you into someone stronger than you ever imagined possible. Basic training at Fort Leonard Wood was designed to break you down completely before building you back up into a soldier. The drill sergeants screamed until their voices were hoarse, made us crawl through mud until we couldn't tell where the earth ended and our bodies began, pushing us past every limit we thought we had. But I thrived in that environment. When other recruits were crying themselves to sleep, I was planning how to excel in the next day's challenges. I wasn't the fastest runner or the strongest in my platoon, but I was relentless. When we had to carry a wounded teammate through an obstacle course, I was the one who refused to let anyone fall behind. When we were given impossible deadlines for completing tasks, I was the one who figured out how to make the impossible merely difficult. The sergeants noticed. More importantly, my fellow soldiers noticed. Leadership wasn't something I actively pursued in those early years. It found me through a series of small moments where someone had to step up, and I was the one who couldn't stand to watch others struggle. During field exercises, when exhausted soldiers were ready to give up, I was the voice that reminded them we were almost at the finish line. When equipment failed and missions went sideways, I was the one who adapted, improvised, found solutions while others were still processing what had gone wrong. The promotions came steadily. Corporal, then sergeant, then staff sergeant. Each rank brought new responsibilities, new challenges, new opportunities to prove that I belonged in rooms where decisions were made that affected hundreds of lives. I specialized in logistics and operations, the unglamorous backbone work that kept armies moving and fed and supplied. While other officers chased combat medals and glory stories, I focused on the intricate puzzle of making sure everyone had what they needed, when they needed it, where they needed it. My first deployment was to Bosnia in the late 90s, during the peacekeeping operations that followed the Dayton Accords. I was a young sergeant then, responsible for coordinating supply convoys through mountain passes where snipers still occasionally took shots at NATO vehicles. The work was tedious and dangerous in equal measure, requiring constant vigilance while managing the mind-numbing details of inventory manifests and transportation schedules. But it was there, navigating the complex ethnic tensions and political landmines of post-war Bosnia, that I learned what it really meant to be a soldier. We weren't just delivering food and medical supplies, we were bringing hope to people who had survived unimaginable horrors. I saw children who had been born during the siege of Sarajevo take their first tentative steps toward trusting strangers in uniform. I watched elderly women who had lost everything smile when they realized we had brought enough heating fuel to keep them warm through another brutal winter. The second deployment was Iraq, during the initial invasion in 2003. By then, I was a lieutenant, leading a company-sized logistics unit responsible for keeping an entire brigade supplied with ammunition, fuel, food, and medical supplies. The pace was relentless, the stakes impossibly high. We convoyed through hostile territory almost daily, our vehicles loaded with everything from MREs to medical morphine, knowing that every trip could be our last if the intelligence about roadside bombs was wrong. I lost my first soldier during that deployment. Private First Class Martinez, barely 20 years old, with a girlfriend back home and dreams of using his GI benefits to become a teacher. His Humvee hid an improvised explosive device on a routine supply run to a forward operating base. The blast was so powerful it flipped the vehicle completely over, crushing him instantly while the rest of his crew walked away with minor injuries. I was the one who had to write the letter to his family. I sat in my tent that night, staring at a blank piece of paper for hours, trying to find words that could possibly explain why their son wasn't coming home. How do you tell parents that their child died delivering toilet paper and bottled water to soldiers who were already relatively safe? How do you make sense of a death that seemed so random, so pointless, so utterly wasteful? But I wrote the letter anyway, because that was my job. Because Martinez deserved to have his sacrifice acknowledged by someone who knew him, who had watched him grow from a scared kid into a competent soldier, who understood that his death mattered even if the mission seemed mundane. I told his parents about his dedication, his sense of humor, his willingness to volunteer for the most dangerous assignments, so that newer soldiers wouldn't have to take the risk. The third deployment was Afghanistan, where I served as a major commanding a battalion-level logistics operation during the height of the surge. The mission was to establish and maintain supply lines across some of the most challenging terrain on Earth, through mountain passes where Taliban fighters had been hiding for centuries, to remote outposts where American soldiers were trying to win hearts and minds one village at a time. It was in Afghanistan that I earned the medals that would later mean nothing to my family when they decided I was too broken to deserve their love. The Bronze Star came from a convoy operation, where we had to fight our way through a coordinated ambush to deliver critical medical supplies to a unit that had taken heavy casualties. The Purple Heart was from the roadside bomb that left me with hearing damage and a traumatic brain injury that would plague me for years afterward. But the decoration I was most proud of wasn't a medal at all. It was a simple thank you note from a young medic whose unit I had kept supplied with blood plasma and surgical equipment during a particularly brutal month of fighting. He wrote that the supplies I delivered had allowed him to save 17 soldiers who would have died without immediate medical intervention. 17 families who got to keep their sons and daughters because I had done my job well. I served for 23 years, rising through the ranks to lieutenant colonel, commanding larger units and taking on greater responsibilities with each promotion. I became the kind of officer that soldiers trusted, the kind of leader who never asked anyone to do something I wouldn't do myself. I ate the same food as my troops, slept in the same conditions, shared the same risks. When I finally retired, my ceremony was attended by generals who spoke about my distinguished service, by soldiers who credited me with keeping them alive, by fellow officers who had watched me navigate impossible situations with grace and competence. The flag they folded and presented to me had flown over combat zones where American soldiers had fought and died and won. That flag now sits in a box in my closet, because the family, who should have been proud of what it represents, decided that the woman who earned it was too damaged to display it in their presence. Coming home from my final deployment should have been a celebration. 23 years of service, a distinguished career, a comfortable military pension, and the promise of finally having time to reconnect with the family I had missed during countless holidays and birthdays overseas. I had dreams of lazy Sunday dinners with my siblings, of being the cool aunt who could finally attend my nieces' and nephews' soccer games, of helping my aging mother with her garden, and listening to her stories about the neighborhood gossip I had missed. The reality was nothing like what I had imagined. The house I had purchased near my family felt too quiet, too still. After decades of sleeping in barracks and forward operating bases where the sounds of generators and radio chatter provided constant background noise, the suburban silence was deafening. I found myself checking locks multiple times before bed, scanning windows for potential threats that didn't exist, startling awake at the sound of garbage trucks that my brain initially processed as incoming mortars. The first family dinner after my retirement was awkward in ways I hadn't anticipated. My mother had prepared all my favorite foods, the traditional Mexican dishes I had craved during years of eating MREs and mess hall food. But sitting around the dining room table where I had grown up, I felt like a stranger observing someone else's life. The conversation flowed around me in Spanish and English, touching on local politics and family drama and television shows I had never seen. When they asked about my service, their questions were surface level, almost perfunctory. Was it dangerous? Did you like it? Are you glad to be home? They wanted simple answers, sound bites that would confirm their preconceptions about military life, without forcing them to confront the reality of what I had actually experienced. When I tried to share real stories, their eyes would glaze over, or they would quickly change the subject to something more comfortable. My sister Maria seemed particularly uncomfortable with my presence. She had always been the family organizer, the one who coordinated gatherings and maintained relationships between deployments. During my years overseas, she had filled the role of the responsible daughter, checking on our mother, handling family crises, being present for all the moments I had missed. Now that I was back, she seemed unsure of where I fit in the family dynamic she had carefully constructed in my absence. The first sign of real trouble came during a 4th of July barbecue at my brother Carlos's house. His neighborhood always went all out for the holiday, with elaborate fireworks displays that started at dusk and continued well into the night. I had been looking forward to it, imagining it would feel good to celebrate Independence Day surrounded by family, after years of observing it on military bases far from home. But when the fireworks started, my body reacted before my mind could process what was happening. The rapid-fire explosions, the whistling sounds of rockets overhead, the sudden flashes of light in my peripheral vision all combined to trigger something primal and unstoppable. I found myself on the ground behind a picnic table, my heart racing, my hands shaking, every muscle tensed for combat that wasn't coming. The worst part wasn't the flashback itself, it was the way my family reacted to it. The children stared with wide, frightened eyes. The adults exchanged worried glances over my head as I struggled to regain my composure. My brother's wife whispered something to him that I couldn't quite hear, but I caught the words "professional help" and "not safe around the kids." I tried to explain later that it was just a temporary reaction, something that would get better with time and therapy. I had already started working with a counselor at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center, learning coping strategies and processing techniques that were helping me manage the symptoms. But the damage was done. That night had confirmed their worst fears about what I had become, what the military had turned me into. The invitations started coming less frequently after that. Family gatherings were scheduled when I was conveniently out of town or already committed to other obligations. When I did attend events, I could feel the tension in the room, the way conversations stopped when I entered, the careful way people spoke around me as if I might explode at any moment. My nephew's girlfriend actually asked me once, with the blunt curiosity of someone too young to understand social boundaries, if I had ever killed anyone. The question hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle, and I watched my family's faces transform with embarrassment and horror. Not because the question was inappropriate, but because they were afraid of what my answer might be. I had killed people. 3 that I was certain of. during convoy operations where hostile forces had attacked us, with small arms fire and rocket-propelled grenades. I had returned fire to protect my soldiers and myself, and I had watched through my rifle scope as enemy fighters fell. It was part of war, part of the job I had signed up to do, part of the burden that came with wearing the uniform and taking the oath to defend my country against all enemies. But I couldn't say that to a 20-year-old college student at a family birthday party. I couldn't explain that taking a life in combat was both easier and harder than civilian minds could comprehend. Easier, because training and adrenaline take over, because the choice is kill or be killed, because there's no time for moral complexity when bullets are flying. Harder, because you carry those faces with you forever, because you wonder about the families those fighters left behind, because even justified killing leaves invisible scars on your soul. So I just said no, and watched the relief flood across the room. It was easier to lie than to watch them struggle with the truth of what I had done in their name, in the name of the freedom they celebrated with backyard barbecues and flag-themed decorations. The symptoms were getting worse, despite the therapy and medication. Loud noises continued to send me into hypervigilant states where I scanned for threats that didn't exist. Crowds made me claustrophobic and paranoid. I had trouble sleeping through the night, waking frequently to check windows and doors, convinced that someone was trying to break in. My appetite disappeared, and I lost weight that I couldn't afford to lose. My family interpreted these struggles as signs of instability rather than symptoms of an injury. They didn't see a wounded warrior working hard to heal. They saw a ticking time bomb that might go off at any moment, threatening their carefully constructed suburban peace. They began to speak about me in hushed tones when they thought I couldn't hear, using words like unstable and dangerous, and eventually, inevitably, crazy. The word followed me like a shadow, whispered behind my back at family gatherings, shared with spouses and friends who had never met me but who nodded knowingly when told about the family member who had come back from war-broken. It became my defining characteristic in their minds, overshadowing everything I had accomplished, everything I had sacrificed, everything I had given in service to my country. I tried to push back against the narrative they were creating, but every attempt to defend myself was seen as further evidence of my instability. When I raised my voice in frustration, they said I was angry and volatile. When I withdrew to protect myself from their judgment, they said I was antisocial and paranoid. There was no way to win, no path back to the acceptance I had once taken for granted. The seeds of my exile had been planted, and they were growing stronger with each passing month. The isolation didn't happen all at once. It crept in slowly, like water seeping through tiny cracks in a foundation, until the whole structure begins to weaken and crumble. At first, it was just subtle changes in how my family interacted with me. Conversations that used to flow naturally now felt stilted and careful. Laughter that once included me now seemed to stop when I entered a room, replaced by polite smiles that never quite reached their eyes. My mother was the first to start treating me differently, though she tried to hide it behind a veil of increased concern. She would call more frequently than before, but the conversations felt like wellness checks rather than genuine connection. "How are you sleeping, Mija?" she would ask, her voice carrying an undertone of worry that made it clear she expected bad news. "Are you taking your medication? Are you seeing your doctor regularly?" The questions themselves weren't unreasonable, but the way she asked them made me feel like a patient rather than her daughter. She never asked about my work with other veterans, never inquired about the small volunteer projects I had started to give structure to my days. Her world had narrowed to focus solely on my symptoms, my struggles, my problems. I had become a medical condition that needed management, rather than a person who deserved love. My sister Maria began finding excuses to limit our time together. Coffee dates were canceled at the last minute due to sudden headaches or work emergencies. Shopping trips that we had planned for weeks would be postponed indefinitely when something more pressing came up. When we did manage to spend time together, she seemed constantly on edge, watching me for signs of whatever breakdown she was apparently expecting. The worst part was how she started editing her own behavior around me. Maria had always been animated when she talked, gesturing with her hands and raising her voice when she got excited about something. But now she spoke to me in the same measured tones people use in hospitals and funeral homes. She monitored her own volume, avoided sudden movements, treated me like I was made of glass that might shatter if handled too roughly. Carlos was more direct in his rejection, though he wrapped it in the language of practical concern. His wife was pregnant with their second child, he explained, and they needed to be careful about who they allowed around their growing family. He never explicitly said I wasn't welcome, but the message was clear. When family dinners moved to restaurants instead of his home, when birthday parties for my niece were held at venues where I could be easily excluded without obvious slight, I watched my access to the children disappear first. My nephew, who had once begged me to tell him stories about different countries I had visited, was suddenly too busy with homework and soccer practice to spend time with his aunt. My niece, who used to light up when I walked into a room, now hid behind her mother's legs when I tried to say hello. They had been taught to fear me, though I doubted anyone had used those exact words. The exclusion became more systematic as months passed. Holiday celebrations that had once been automatically scheduled around my availability now happened without consulting me. I would learn about family gatherings through social media posts, seeing pictures of everyone together at events I hadn't even known were taking place. When I asked why I hadn't been invited, the excuses were always plausible but never quite convincing. "We thought you might be uncomfortable with all the noise," they would say about a birthday party. "We didn't want to overwhelm you with so many people," they would explain about a graduation celebration. "We figured you were probably too tired," they would offer about a holiday dinner. Each excuse chipped away a little more of my place in the family structure, until I began to wonder if I had ever really belonged at all. The breaking point came during what was supposed to be a family intervention, though they never called it that. My mother invited me for Sunday dinner, emphasizing how much she missed our regular talks, and how important it was for us to spend quality time together. I dressed carefully for the occasion, choosing conservative clothes and practicing normal conversation topics in my car before going inside. But when I arrived, the entire family was waiting for me in the living room, sitting in a careful semicircle like a tribunal. My mother, Maria, Carlos, even my teenage nephew and his girlfriend, all wearing expressions of grim determination mixed with barely concealed fear. The coffee table was covered with printed articles about post-traumatic stress disorder, brochures for residential treatment facilities, and contact information for private psychiatric hospitals. They had done their research, they explained. They had consulted with professionals, read expert opinions, educated themselves about the challenges facing veterans with combat-related trauma. The conclusion they had reached was that I needed intensive, long-term treatment in a controlled environment where I could receive round-the-clock care from people trained to handle cases like mine. Carlos did most of the talking, reading from notes he had prepared in advance. He spoke about liability concerns and insurance implications and legal ramifications that could affect the whole family if something happened. He mentioned incidents that had never occurred, conversations where I had supposedly made threatening statements, episodes of rage and violence that existed only in their collective imagination. When I tried to interrupt to correct the false narrative they had constructed, Maria held up her hand to stop me. "Elena, this is exactly what we're talking about," she said, her voice trembling with what she clearly believed was justified fear. "You can't see how your behavior affects other people. You don't realize how frightening you can be when you get agitated like this." I wasn't agitated. I was confused and hurt and desperate to understand how we had arrived at this moment. But my attempts to defend myself were interpreted as evidence of the very instability they were claiming to address. The more I protested their characterization of me, the more convinced they became that their intervention was necessary. My mother delivered the final blow with tears in her eyes and steel in her voice. "Mija, we love you too much to watch you destroy yourself. And we love our children too much to put them at risk. You need help that we can't provide. Professional help. Until you get that help, until you can prove that you're stable and safe, we think it's best if you take some time away from the family." The words hit me like physical blows. Take time away from the family, as if I was the problem that needed to be solved. As if 23 years of service to my country had somehow disqualified me from deserving their love and support. As if the invisible wounds I carried from protecting their freedom made me too dangerous to be around their children. I looked around the room at faces I had known and loved my entire life, searching for even one person who might speak up on my behalf. But they had already made their decision. I had become a liability to be managed, rather than a family member to be supported. The consensus was complete, unanimous, and apparently non-negotiable. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me, and walked toward the door without saying another word. Behind me, I could hear my mother crying and my sister trying to comfort her, discussing plans for getting me the help I apparently needed. They spoke about me as if I had already left, as if I was already gone from their lives. And in that moment, I realized that I was. I walked out of my mother's house that night carrying nothing but my purse and car keys, leaving behind not just a family dinner but the last remnants of my childhood belief that blood was thicker than anything else in the world. The drive back to my apartment passed in a blur of streetlights and stop signs that I navigated on autopilot, my mind still reeling from the systematic dismantling of my place in the family I had served and protected from thousands of miles away. The apartment felt different when I unlocked the door, smaller somehow, as if the walls had contracted while I was gone. I sat on my couch in the dark for hours, still wearing the careful outfit I had chosen for what I thought would be a reconciliation dinner, staring at the framed photographs on my coffee table. Pictures of holiday gatherings where I stood smiling next to the same people who had just told me I was too dangerous to be around their children. The phone started ringing around 10 o'clock. My mother, probably, called to see if I had made it home safely or perhaps to continue the conversation we had started. I let it ring until the answering machine picked up, then listened to her voice echo through the empty room, pleading with me to understand that everything they had said came from a place of love, that they wanted to help me get better, that they hoped someday I would thank them for caring enough to intervene. I didn't return the call that night, or the next day, or the day after that. When Maria called to invite me to a family barbecue the following weekend, speaking in the same careful tone she had used during the intervention, I politely declined. When Carlos left a voicemail suggesting we meet for coffee to discuss treatment options he had researched, I deleted the message without listening to it all the way through. The silence that followed wasn't comfortable, but it was honest. For the first time in months, I wasn't walking on eggshells around people who claimed to love me while simultaneously fearing me. I wasn't monitoring my own reactions to make sure I didn't display any symptoms that might confirm their worst assumptions about my mental state. I wasn't pretending that their rejection didn't cut deeper than any enemy fire I had faced overseas. But isolation has its own particular form of cruelty, especially when it's imposed by the people who are supposed to know you best. The holidays that year were brutal exercises in forced normalcy. I volunteered at the Veterans Affairs Hospital on Thanksgiving, serving meals to veterans who had nowhere else to go, trying not to think about the empty chair at my family's table that used to be mine. Christmas Eve found me attending midnight mass alone, sitting in the back pew of the church where I had been confirmed, watching families celebrate together while I struggled not to wonder what my nieces and nephews were getting from Santa Claus. The worst part wasn't the loneliness itself, though that was crushing enough. It was the way my family's rejection began to color how I saw myself. When the people who have known you longest, and who should love you most, decide that you're fundamentally broken, it becomes increasingly difficult to maintain your own sense of worth and identity. I started to wonder if maybe they were right. Maybe I was damaged beyond repair. Maybe the war had changed me into someone who was genuinely dangerous to be around. I threw myself into work with other veterans, partly because it gave me purpose, and partly because it was the only place where my experiences were seen as strengths rather than symptoms. At the VA hospital, my combat experience was an asset that helped me connect with young soldiers struggling with their own invisible wounds. In support groups for female veterans, my rank and service record gave me credibility when I spoke about the challenges of reintegrating into civilian life. But even in those spaces, I carried the weight of my family's rejection like a stone in my chest. When other veterans talked about going home for holidays or bringing their children to visit grandparents, I stayed quiet about my own situation. It was easier to let people assume I was estranged from my family by choice, rather than explain that the people who should have been proudest of my service were the ones who feared me most. The months turned into a year, then 2 years, then 3. I built a life that was meaningful and productive, working with veteran advocacy organizations, and helping other former soldiers navigate the bureaucracy of disability claims and mental health services. I found purpose in translating military experience into civilian terms for employers who wanted to hire veterans but didn't understand how to evaluate their skills. I discovered that my logistics background made me valuable to nonprofit organizations that needed someone who could manage complex operations on tight budgets. But no amount of professional success could fill the hole left by my family's abandonment. I attended weddings and graduations and birthday parties for the veterans I worked with, always happy to celebrate their milestones, while acutely aware that my own family had decided I was too unstable to be included in similar celebrations. I watched other women my age become grandmothers, posting pictures of holidays spent with multiple generations gathered around dinner tables, and tried not to think about the grandchildren I would never know because their parents had decided I was too dangerous to meet them. The breaking point came when I learned about my nephew's engagement through a Facebook post. Miguel, the little boy who used to beg me to tell him stories about different countries, was getting married to a girl I had never met. The announcement was full of details about wedding plans and venue selections and guest lists that obviously didn't include me. In the comments, family members who I hadn't spoken to in years offered congratulations and shared memories of watching Miguel grow up. Memories that apparently didn't include his aunt, who had missed most of his childhood due to military deployments. I stared at that post for hours, scrolling through decades of family photos where I appeared sporadically between deployments, always in uniform, always about to leave again for some distant conflict. I had missed so much of his life already, serving my country while other people raised my family's children. Now I was going to miss his wedding too, not because I was deployed overseas, but because the people who had benefited from my service had decided I was too broken to deserve a place at the celebration. That night, I made a decision that felt both inevitable and devastating. I stopped trying to maintain connection with people who had already written me out of their lives. I stopped sending birthday cards that went unacknowledged, and Christmas gifts that were probably thrown away unopened. I stopped following their social media accounts and checking up on family news through mutual friends. I accepted that the woman who had served her country with distinction for 23 years was not welcome in the family she had protected from thousands of miles away. The grief was immense and complicated, like mourning people who were still alive but had chosen to become dead to you. I grieved not just for the relationships I had lost, but for the version of myself who had believed that love was unconditional and that family meant something more than shared DNA. I grieved for the children I would never know as adults, for the grandchildren I would never hold, for the holiday traditions that would continue without me as if I had never existed at all. But I also felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in years, I wasn't performing stability for an audience that was looking for evidence of my instability. I wasn't monitoring my own reactions to make sure I didn't confirm their worst fears about what the military had done to me. I wasn't pretending that their love was worth the constant surveillance and judgment that came with it. I was free to be broken and healing at the same time, to struggle with symptoms without having those struggles used as evidence against my character. I was free to build relationships with people who saw my service as honorable rather than damaging, who understood that invisible wounds were still real wounds that deserved care rather than condemnation. What I didn't know was that this freedom would lead me to a moment of unexpected recognition at a family event I attended only by accident, where a stranger would see me more clearly than my own blood ever had. The years that followed my family's rejection taught me how to live in the spaces between worlds, existing in a liminal place where I was neither fully civilian nor actively military, neither completely alone nor meaningfully connected. I learned to navigate grocery stores during off-peak hours to avoid crowds that made my chest tighten with unexplained anxiety. I discovered which coffee shops played music soft enough that I could sit and read without being startled by sudden sounds. I mapped out a life that accommodated my invisible wounds while still allowing me to function with a degree of dignity. My apartment became a carefully controlled environment where every detail was designed to minimize triggers while maximizing my sense of safety and autonomy. The furniture was arranged so I could see all entrances and exits from wherever I sat. The windows had security film that couldn't be easily broken, and the doors had multiple locks that I checked obsessively before bed. I kept emergency supplies stored in strategic locations throughout the space, habits ingrained by years of deployment preparation that now served to calm the hypervigilant part of my brain that never quite believed I was truly safe. The work I did with other veterans became my anchor, the thing that gave structure and meaning to days that might otherwise have felt empty and purposeless. At the Regional VA Medical Center, I ran support groups for female veterans dealing with military sexual trauma and combat-related PTSD. The women who came to those meetings understood things about me that my own family never had, recognized symptoms in each other that civilians often missed or misinterpreted. There was Maria Santos, a former Air Force mechanic who couldn't sleep through the night without checking every lock in her house 3 times. Jessica Chen, an Army medic who flinched whenever someone approached her from behind, even in perfectly safe environments. Carmen Williams, a Navy logistics specialist who couldn't go to movies or concerts because the crowds and noise sent her into panic attacks that looked like heart attacks to people who didn't know better. We shared stories in that circle that we could never tell our families, experiences that were too raw and complicated for people who had never worn the uniform to understand. We talked about the strange relief of being deployed, where everyone around you understood why you were hypervigilant and paranoid, because those traits actually kept you alive. We discussed the crushing disappointment of coming home to people who expected you to just flip a switch and become the person you were before you left, as if war was something you could simply wash off in the shower. The group became a lifeline for all of us, a place where we could be broken and healing simultaneously without having to apologize for the process or timeline of our recovery. When Maria had a flashback triggered by a car backfiring in the parking lot, we knew exactly how to help her ground herself without making her feel ashamed of her reaction. When Jessica couldn't stop crying during a particularly difficult session, we sat with her in silence until she was ready to speak, understanding that sometimes tears were the only way to process experiences that had no adequate words. Outside of the VA, I worked with a nonprofit organization that helped military families navigate the bureaucracy of disability claims and healthcare benefits. The job required me to translate between 2 worlds, explaining military culture to civilian administrators who had never served, while helping veterans understand systems that seemed designed to confuse and discourage them from accessing the services they had earned. The work was meaningful but emotionally exhausting, requiring me to relive my own struggles with the VA system while advocating for others who were facing similar challenges. I spent hours on the phone with caseworkers who seemed to view every claim as potential fraud, fought battles with insurance companies that didn't understand how military injuries translated into civilian limitations, attended hearings where decorated veterans had to prove to bureaucrats that their disabilities were real and service-connected. My own disability claim had taken 3 years to process, 3 years of medical examinations and psychological evaluations and paperwork that required me to document every way that my military service had damaged my ability to function in civilian life. The process was designed to be adversarial, treating veterans like potential criminals rather than people who had sacrificed their physical and mental health in service to their country. The rating I eventually received acknowledged that I had a service-connected disability but quantified my suffering in percentages that felt simultaneously too much and not enough. 70% disabled due to post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury from my deployment to Afghanistan. The number meant I qualified for certain benefits and accommodations. But it also meant that my family's assessment of my mental state had been partially validated by federal bureaucrats who had never met me before my injury. I lived on my military pension and disability payments, supplemented by the modest salary from my nonprofit work. The money was enough to maintain a simple lifestyle, to afford the therapy and medication that helped me manage my symptoms, to occasionally treat myself to small luxuries that made the isolation more bearable. But no amount of financial security could fill the void left by my family's abandonment or restore the sense of belonging that had been stripped away along with their love. The loneliness was a constant companion, especially during holidays and family celebrations that I experienced secondhand through social media posts and overheard conversations. I learned to avoid Facebook during wedding season and graduation time, periods when my timeline would be filled with pictures of families celebrating together, while I sat alone in my apartment wondering what my nephew looked like in his cap and gown, or whether my niece had inherited my mother's talent for baking elaborate birthday cakes. I tried dating occasionally, meeting men through veteran organizations or online platforms designed for people over 50 who were starting their lives over. But the relationships never progressed beyond casual dinners and awkward conversations about my military service and family situation. How do you explain to someone that the people who should know you best have decided you're too dangerous to be around their children? How do you build intimacy with someone new when your own blood relatives have concluded that you're fundamentally broken? The few men who seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me better inevitably reached a point where they wanted to meet my family, to understand my background and support system. When I explained that I wasn't in contact with my relatives, they would nod sympathetically and ask gentle questions about what had caused the estrangement. But their faces would change when I mentioned PTSD and family concerns about stability, when I had to acknowledge that my own mother and siblings had decided I was too unstable to be included in their lives. Some men backed away immediately, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of dating someone whose own family had rejected them. Others tried to be supportive, but eventually grew tired of my hypervigilance and anxiety symptoms, the way I startled at unexpected sounds or insisted on sitting with my back to the wall in restaurants. They wanted to fix me or save me or help me overcome my past, but none of them understood that healing from invisible wounds is not a linear process with a clear endpoint. So I learned to be alone without being lonely, to find satisfaction in small accomplishments and quiet pleasures that didn't require anyone else's approval or participation. I read voraciously, consuming books about history and psychology and memoirs written by other veterans who had struggled with similar challenges. I gardened on my small apartment balcony, growing herbs and vegetables that connected me to the earth in ways that felt grounding and peaceful. I volunteered at an animal shelter, walking dogs and socializing cats, who had also been abandoned by the people who were supposed to care for them. The animals didn't judge me for my invisible wounds or expect me to be someone I couldn't be. They accepted my affection and attention without demanding explanations for my symptoms or timelines for my recovery. A three-legged German shepherd named Rex became my favorite walking companion, both of us carrying scars from our service that made us outcasts in a world that preferred its heroes to be perfectly intact. What I didn't know was that this carefully constructed life of purposeful isolation was about to be disrupted by a wedding invitation that would arrive 3 years after I had given up hope of ever being included in my family's celebrations again. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in late spring, slipped under my apartment door while I was at my weekly therapy appointment. I almost threw it away without opening it, assuming it was another piece of junk mail or a wedding announcement from someone I barely knew. The envelope was cream-colored and formal, with my name written in elegant calligraphy that looked expensive and deliberate. When I finally opened it, I stared at the contents for several long minutes before the words fully registered. Miguel Antonio Rodriguez and Sofia Elena Castillo request the honor of your presence at their wedding celebration. My nephew, the little boy who used to build forts out of couch cushions and demand bedtime stories about far-off places, was getting married. The woman he was marrying shared my middle name, a detail that felt like some cosmic joke given that I had been exiled from the family before I could meet her. The invitation was beautifully designed, with raised lettering and delicate borders that spoke of significant expense and careful planning. The ceremony would be held at St. Augustine Cathedral, the same church where I had been baptized and confirmed, where my parents had been married 40 years earlier. The reception would follow at the Riverside Country Club, a venue that required substantial deposits and guest lists that had probably been agonized over for months. I turned the invitation over in my hands repeatedly, looking for some explanation of why I was being included after 3 years of complete radio silence from my family. There was no personal note, no acknowledgement of the time that had passed or the circumstances that had led to our estrangement. Just the formal request for my presence at what would undoubtedly be the largest family gathering in years. My first instinct was to decline politely and return to the quiet life I had built without them. Attending the wedding would mean facing all the relatives who had participated in my exile, pretending that nothing had happened while navigating conversations with people who had been told I was unstable and potentially dangerous. It would mean watching my family celebrate together while I sat alone at whatever table they assigned to distant relatives and family friends who didn't quite fit anywhere else. But there was something about the invitation that I couldn't dismiss, some small spark of hope that maybe things had changed, that maybe enough time had passed for my family to reconsider their assessment of who I was and what I represented. Miguel had been my favorite nephew, the child I had been closest to before my deployment started taking me away for months at a time. I had missed his high school graduation, his college years, his engagement announcement. This might be my only chance to be present for a milestone that mattered to him. I spent 2 weeks debating whether to attend, weighing the potential benefits against the almost certain emotional cost. I called my therapist for an emergency session to discuss the decision, unpacking all the complicated feelings that the invitation had stirred up. Dr. Martinez listened patiently as I oscillated between hope and cynicism, between the desire to reconnect with my family and the fear of being rejected all over again. "What's the worst thing that could happen if you go?" she asked during our session. I could think of dozens of worst-case scenarios. Being ignored by relatives who didn't know how to talk to me, having my symptoms triggered by the crowd and noise, overhearing conversations about my mental state, being asked to leave if someone decided my presence was making other guests uncomfortable. "And what's the worst thing that could happen if you don't go?" she continued. The answer to that question was simpler, but somehow more devastating. I would spend the rest of my life wondering if I had missed my only chance to be part of my family again, regretting the choice to stay safe instead of risking everything for the possibility of reconciliation. In the end, I decided to attend the ceremony but skipped the reception. I would sit in the back of the church, witness my nephew's marriage, and slip out quietly before anyone felt obligated to make awkward conversation with the family member they had spent years avoiding. It felt like a compromise that honored both my desire to be present for Miguel and my need to protect myself from potential humiliation. I bought a new dress for the occasion, something conservative and elegant that wouldn't draw attention or give anyone reason to comment on my appearance. Navy blue with 3/4 sleeves, appropriate for a morning ceremony at a Catholic church. I had my hair professionally styled for the first time in years, wanting to look like someone who had her life together even if I felt like I was falling apart on the inside. The morning of the wedding, I took extra time with my medication and meditation routine, trying to prepare myself mentally for whatever the day might bring. I practiced breathing exercises in my car before entering the church, reminding myself that I had survived combat zones and family interventions and 3 years of exile. I could survive a few hours in a church pew, surrounded by people who had once loved me. St. Augustine Cathedral looked exactly as I remembered it from childhood, with soaring ceilings and stained glass windows that cast colored light across the wooden pews. The altar was decorated with white roses and baby's breath, simple but elegant arrangements that reflected Sophia's taste, since I had never met her and had no idea what she preferred. The church was fuller than I had expected, with what looked like several hundred guests filling the space with quiet conversation and the rustle of formal clothing. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. I slipped into a pew near the back, choosing a spot where I could see the altar but remain relatively invisible to the other guests. A few people glanced my way as I settled into the wooden seat, but no one approached or acknowledged me. I recognized some faces from family gatherings years earlier, cousins and family friends who looked older, but essentially unchanged. The processional music began, and I watched as the wedding party made their way down the aisle. My nephew's groomsmen were young men I didn't recognize, probably college friends or coworkers from his job at an engineering firm. The bridesmaids were dressed in pale pink, their faces glowing with the particular happiness that comes from celebrating someone you love. When the bride appeared at the back of the church, the entire congregation rose to their feet. Sophia was beautiful in the way that all brides are beautiful, radiant with joy and anticipation as she walked toward the man she had chosen to spend her life with. But I found myself watching Miguel instead, seeing in his face the echo of the little boy who used to climb into my lap and ask me to tell him about the different foods I had eaten in foreign countries. He had grown into a handsome man, tall and confident in his formal tuxedo, his dark hair slicked back in a style that reminded me of our grandfather. When Sophia reached the altar and took his hand, his smile was so bright it made my chest ache with a mixture of pride and grief. I was witnessing one of the most important moments of his life from the back of a church, present but not really included, watching from the periphery of a family that had decided I no longer belonged. The ceremony itself was traditional and lovely, full of readings about love and commitment and building a life together. I found myself crying quietly during the exchange of vows, moved by the obvious affection between Miguel and Sofia, but also mourning the relationships that had been lost, the family connections that had been severed by fear and misunderstanding. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife and Miguel kissed his new bride, the congregation erupted in applause and joyful noise that made me flinch reflexively. But I clapped along with everyone else, celebrating from a distance the nephew I loved but was no longer allowed to know. As the recessional music began and the wedding party made their way back down the aisle, I prepared to slip out quietly through a side door. But as Miguel and Sofia passed my pew, my nephew's eyes found mine across the crowded church. For just a moment, his expression shifted from wedding day joy to something more complex, a mixture of surprise and recognition, and what might have been regret. He slowed his pace slightly, as if he might stop to speak to me, but Sofia tugged gently on his arm, and the moment passed. They continued down the aisle toward their reception and their new life together, while I sat frozen in my pew, wondering if that brief eye contact had been acknowledgement or accusation, or simply surprise at seeing the aunt who had disappeared from his life 3 years earlier. What I didn't know was that among the wedding guests filing out of the church behind the happy couple was a federal judge who had recognized something in me that my own family had never seen. The reception line outside the church moved with the peculiar rhythm of formal celebrations, guests clustering and dispersing as they offered congratulations to the newly married couple before heading to their cars for the drive to the country club. I had planned to avoid this part entirely, to slip away through the side entrance while everyone else was focused on the happy couple. But something about Miguel's expression, when our eyes met during the recessional, had planted a seed of hope that I couldn't quite dismiss. I found myself joining the line almost without conscious decision, carried along by the crowd of well-wishers and the inexplicable pull of wanting to speak to my nephew on his wedding day. The wait gave me time to second-guess the choice, to rehearse what I might say in the 30 seconds I would have before moving along to make room for the next guest. Congratulations seemed insufficient but safe. I love you felt too loaded with the weight of our complicated history. As I moved closer to the front of the line, I could see my family members more clearly. My mother stood beside the bride's parents, her silver hair elegantly styled, wearing a dress I didn't recognize in a shade of purple that had always been her favorite color. She looked older than I remembered, frailer somehow, though still maintaining the regal bearing that had made her such a formidable presence in my childhood. Maria was there too, directing traffic and managing logistics with the efficiency that had made her the family organizer. She wore a champagne-colored dress that complemented her role as what appeared to be the unofficial wedding coordinator, carrying a small notebook and occasionally whispering instructions to various family members. She hadn't seen me yet, or if she had, she was pretending not to notice. Carlos stood slightly apart from the group, his expression carefully neutral, as he made polite conversation with guests I didn't recognize. His wife Elena held their youngest daughter's hand while their teenage son fidgeted with his tie and checked his phone repeatedly. They looked like the picture-perfect suburban family they had always aspired to be, successful and stable and untouched by the kind of complications I represented. The line moved forward incrementally, bringing me closer to the moment I would have to decide what to say and how to say it. My heart was beating faster than it should have been, the familiar spike of adrenaline that my body produced in response to any situation it perceived as potentially threatening. I practiced the breathing exercises Dr. Martinez had taught me, trying to center myself before what could either be a moment of reconciliation or another painful rejection. When I was finally close enough to see Miguel's face clearly, I realized he had been watching for me, scanning the faces in the line with an intensity that suggested he was as nervous about our interaction as I was. Sofia stood beside him, radiant in her white dress, graciously accepting congratulations from people she was meeting for the first time. She had no idea who I was, or what my presence might mean to the family dynamics of her new husband's relatives. The guest ahead of me was an elderly woman who seemed to know the bride's family well, engaging Sofia in an extended conversation about wedding planning and honeymoon destinations. I used the time to study my nephew's face, looking for traces of the boy I had known in the features of the man he had become. He had inherited my father's strong jawline and my mother's expressive eyes. But there was something new there too, a confidence and maturity that came from building a life independent of the family drama that had shaped his childhood. When it was finally my turn, I stepped forward with what I hoped was an appropriate smile, extending my hand in the formal greeting that seemed safest given the circumstances. "Congratulations, Miguel," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I had expected. "You look very handsome, and Sophia is beautiful." He didn't take my hand immediately, instead staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. For a moment, I thought he might ignore me entirely, might simply turn away and leave me, standing there while the line backed up behind me. But then he stepped forward and pulled me into a hug that was brief but genuine, his arms strong around my shoulders in a gesture that reminded me of the little boy who used to run to greet me whenever I came home on leave. "Tia Elena," he whispered against my ear, using the childhood nickname he hadn't spoken in years. "I wasn't sure you would come." The words hit me harder than I had expected, carrying years of accumulated grief and missed opportunities. I pulled back to look at his face, searching for some indication of what he was thinking, what my presence meant to him on this day that was supposed to be perfect and uncomplicated. "I almost didn't," I admitted, glancing nervously at Sophia, who was watching our interaction with polite curiosity. "But I couldn't miss your wedding day." Miguel's smile was sad and complicated, acknowledging everything that had been lost between us while still expressing genuine pleasure at seeing me there. "I'm glad you came," he said simply. "Sophia, this is my Aunt Elena, the one I told you about." "The one I told you about." I wondered what exactly he had said, what stories he had shared about the aunt who had disappeared from family gatherings. Whether he had explained the circumstances that led to my exile, or simply mentioned that I existed somewhere on the periphery of his family tree. Sophia extended her hand with a warm smile that seemed genuinely welcoming rather than politely obligatory. "Elena, it's so wonderful to meet you finally. Miguel has told me so many stories about your travels and your service. Thank you for being here today." Her words were carefully chosen, acknowledging my military background without making it the defining characteristic of our brief interaction. I could see why Miguel had fallen in love with her. There was a kindness in her eyes and a grace in her manner that suggested she might be the type of person who could love a family despite its complications rather than in spite of them. "Thank you for including me," I replied, though I still wasn't sure who had made the decision to send me an invitation. "You make a beautiful bride, and I can see why Miguel is so happy." The moment was interrupted by the approach of someone behind me in line, a reminder that this interaction had to end soon to make room for other well-wishers. But before I could step away, Miguel reached out and touched my arm gently. "Will you be at the reception?" he asked, his voice carrying a hopefulness that made my chest tighten with unexpected emotion. I had planned to decline, to disappear back to my apartment and the safety of my carefully controlled environment. But looking at his face, seeing the genuine desire for my presence despite everything that had happened, I found myself nodding before I could think better of it. "I'll be there," I said, though I had no idea how I would navigate a reception full of family members who had spent 3 years avoiding me. As I moved away from the receiving line to make room for the next guest, I caught sight of my mother watching me from across the courtyard. Our eyes met for just a moment before she looked away, her expression unreadable. Maria had noticed me too, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands as she stared at me with what looked like a mixture of shock and dismay. I walked toward my car feeling like I was moving through a dream, unsure of what had just happened, or what it might mean for the carefully constructed boundaries I had built around my new life. The decision to attend the reception felt both necessary and terrifying, a choice that could either begin to heal old wounds or tear them open all over again. What I didn't know was that among the guests streaming out of the church behind me was a man who had recognized something in my bearing that my own family had forgotten. Someone who would see past the narrative of instability and danger to remember who I really was. The Riverside Country Club sat on a bluff overlooking the valley, its manicured grounds and colonial architecture, speaking to the kind of old money respectability that my family had always aspired to but never quite achieved. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes after arriving, watching other guests walk confidently toward the entrance, while I tried to summon the courage to follow them inside. The reception had already begun. I could hear the distant sound of music and laughter floating across the perfectly trimmed lawns. I had changed my mind about attending at least 6 times during the drive from the church, pulling over twice to call Dr. Martinez and leave rambling voicemails about whether this was a healthy decision or an act of self-sabotage disguised as family reconciliation. But something about Miguel's expression when he asked if I would be there had made it impossible to simply drive home and pretend the day had never happened. The country club's interior was exactly what I had expected. Crystal chandeliers, oil paintings of long-dead members, thick carpets that muffled sound and suggested generations of wealth and privilege. A hostess in a crisp white shirt directed me toward the ballroom, where the reception was being held, her smile professionally pleasant, but lacking any real warmth. I wondered if she could sense my discomfort, if my anxiety was visible to strangers trained to read the subtle social cues that determined who belonged in spaces like this. The ballroom was elegant and intimidating, with tall windows that overlooked the golf course and round tables draped in white linens and adorned with centerpieces of white roses and baby's breath. The wedding party was seated at a long head table at the front of the room, while the other guests had been arranged at tables that seemed to follow some complex algorithm of family relationships and social hierarchies that I couldn't decipher. I approached the table where place cards were arranged alphabetically, searching for my name among the neat calligraphy that designated where each guest belonged for the evening. For a moment I panicked, thinking that perhaps my invitation had been a mistake, that there was no place set for the family member who had been exiled for 3 years. But then I found it. Elena Rodriguez, table 12. Table 12 was positioned near the back of the room, far from the head table and the center of attention. When I approached, I discovered I had been seated with what appeared to be a collection of family friends and distant relatives. People who knew each other peripherally, but didn't seem to fit into any of the main family groups. There was an elderly couple who introduced themselves as friends of Sophia's grandparents, a middle-aged woman who worked with someone's cousin, and a distinguished-looking man in his 60s who was seated directly across from me. The man stood when I approached the table, extending his hand with the kind of old-fashioned courtesy that suggested military bearing or legal training. Judge Robert Harrison, he introduced himself, his handshake firm but not aggressive. And you must be Elena. Miguel mentioned you might be joining us. Judge Harrison. The title carried weight in a way that made me straighten my posture automatically, though I couldn't immediately place how he connected to my family or the wedding celebration. He was tall and silver-haired, with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of calm presence that suggested someone accustomed to being listened to when he spoke. Miguel spoke about me? I asked, taking my seat and trying to process this unexpected information. It seemed impossible that my nephew would have discussed me with a federal judge, especially given that my family had spent years characterizing me as unstable and potentially dangerous. He did, Judge Harrison confirmed, settling back into his chair with the measured movements of someone who chose his words carefully. He mentioned that his aunt Elena was a decorated Army veteran who had served multiple deployments overseas. He seemed quite proud of your service record. The words hit me like a physical blow, unexpected in their kindness and completely at odds with the narrative my family had constructed about me over the past 3 years. Miguel was proud of my service. He had spoken about me to others, had described me as decorated rather than damaged, had remembered the accomplishments rather than focusing solely on the struggles that followed. I'm surprised he mentioned me at all, I admitted, glancing toward the head table where Miguel was engaged in animated conversation with his groomsmen. We haven't spoken in quite some time. Judge Harrison followed my gaze, his expression thoughtful. Family relationships can be complicated, especially when military service is involved. People don't always understand the challenges of transitioning back to civilian life. Hi, Apps. There was something in his tone that suggested personal experience, a depth of understanding that went beyond academic knowledge or professional observation. I studied his face more carefully, looking for clues about his own background, wondering if he had served or if someone close to him had worn the uniform. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the other guests at our table, a flurry of introductions and small talk about the beautiful ceremony and the elegant reception venue. I participated minimally, responding politely when spoken to but mostly listening to the comfortable chatter of people who belonged in spaces like this, who moved through social situations with the ease that comes from never having been told you're too dangerous to be around children. During the cocktail hour, I excused myself to visit the restroom, needing a few minutes away from the noise and social pressure to collect myself and practice the breathing exercises that helped keep my anxiety manageable. The bathroom was mercifully empty, all marble surfaces and gold fixtures that reflected my pale face back at me from multiple angles. I looked tired, older than my 58 years, but not obviously unstable or threatening. When I returned to the ballroom, the formal dinner service had begun. Waiters moved efficiently between tables, serving what appeared to be an elaborate meal of salmon and beef tenderloin with accompanying vegetables, artfully arranged on expensive china. The conversation at our table flowed around topics I had little experience with: local politics, country club gossip, recent vacations to destinations I had never visited for pleasure. But Judge Harrison seemed determined to include me in the conversation, asking thoughtful questions about my work with veterans and my experience navigating the disability claims process. His interest appeared genuine rather than politely obligatory, and I found myself relaxing slightly as I described the advocacy work that had given structure and meaning to my post-military life. The system can be incredibly frustrating for veterans, I explained, cutting my salmon into precise pieces while I spoke. The bureaucracy treats every claim as potential fraud, and the appeals process can take years. Meanwhile, people who served their country honorably are struggling to access basic health care and benefits they've earned. I've seen some of those cases come through my court, Judge Harrison said quietly. The disparities in how claims are handled can be truly shocking. It's clear that many veterans aren't getting the support they deserve. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a spoon tapping against crystal, the universal signal that speeches were about to begin. The room quieted as Miguel's best man stood up at the head table, launching into a toast that was equal parts embarrassing childhood stories and genuine affection for the groom. I watched my nephew's face during the speech, seeing him laugh at memories I hadn't been present to witness. Moments from his college years and early adulthood that had happened during my exile from the family. There was so much of his life I had missed, so many milestones and mundane moments that had been shaped by my absence. When it was Miguel's turn to speak, he stood with the confidence of someone comfortable being the center of attention, his voice carrying clear across the ballroom as he thanked his guests for being there to celebrate with him and Sophia. He spoke about love and commitment and building a life together, his words carefully chosen and delivered with obvious sincerity. But then his speech took an unexpected turn. I also want to acknowledge someone who couldn't be with us for many years, but who helped shape who I am today, he said, his eyes scanning the room until they found mine at table 12. My Aunt Elena taught me that service to others is the highest calling, that protecting people who can't protect themselves is worth any sacrifice. She showed me what courage looks like, even when that courage isn't recognized or appreciated by the people who should understand it best. The ballroom fell silent, except for the gentle clink of silverware against china. I felt every eye in the room turn toward me, including those of family members who had spent years avoiding my presence. My mother's face was pale with what looked like shock or possibly embarrassment. Maria stared at me with an expression I couldn't read, while Carlos kept his eyes fixed on his plate. Judge Harrison was looking at me too, but his expression was different from the others. There was recognition there, and something that looked almost like respect. When Miguel raised his glass for a toast, Judge Harrison was the first person at our table to stand, lifting his champagne flute toward me in a gesture that felt like acknowledgement of something my own family had never been able to see. What happened next would change everything. After Miguel's speech, the atmosphere in the ballroom shifted in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. Conversations resumed around the room, but I could feel the weight of glances directed toward table 12, toward the family member who had been publicly acknowledged after years of exile. Some looks carried curiosity, others confusion, and a few unmistakable expressions of disapproval from relatives who clearly felt that Miguel's recognition of me was inappropriate given what they believed about my mental state. Judge Harrison settled back into his chair after the toast, but I noticed he was studying me with increased intensity, as if Miguel's words had confirmed something he had already suspected. The other guests at our table seemed uncertain how to react to what had just happened, offering polite smiles while clearly trying to process the dynamics they had just witnessed. That was quite a tribute, Judge Harrison said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made me look at him more carefully. It takes courage to acknowledge someone publicly when others might disapprove. I nodded, still processing the emotional impact of hearing my nephew defend me in front of the entire family that had rejected me. Miguel has always been brave, I replied, though my voice was shakier than I intended. Even as a little boy, he stood up for what he thought was right. The dancing portion of the evening began with Miguel and Sophia's first dance, a slow waltz that they had clearly practiced extensively. They moved together with the kind of synchronization that comes from genuine partnership, Sophia's white dress flowing gracefully as Miguel spun her around the polished dance floor. Other couples gradually joined them, parents and grandparents and wedding party members, creating a tableau of celebration and joy. I watched from my table, content to be an observer rather than a participant in the festivities. Dancing required a level of physical and emotional vulnerability that I wasn't ready for, especially in a room full of people who had varying opinions about my mental stability. But the music was beautiful, a mix of traditional wedding songs and contemporary ballads that created a romantic atmosphere despite the underlying family tensions. During a lull between songs, Judge Harrison excused himself from the table, mentioning something about speaking with the bride's father about a mutual acquaintance. I assumed he was simply making polite conversation with other guests, the kind of social networking that happens naturally at formal events, where people from different circles come together. But when he returned 20 minutes later, his demeanor had changed in a way that was difficult to define. He seemed more focused, more intentional, as if he had learned something during his absence that had shifted his perspective on the evening's events. "Elena," he said, settling back into his chair with the careful movements of someone about to broach a delicate subject. "I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of asking Miguel a few questions about your military service. I was particularly interested in your deployment to Afghanistan." Something in his tone made my chest tighten with familiar anxiety. Questions about my service usually led to uncomfortable conversations about combat experiences and psychological evaluations, topics I preferred to avoid in social settings. But there was nothing threatening in Judge Harrison's manner, nothing that suggested he was fishing for evidence of instability or seeking confirmation of the narrative my family had constructed about me. "What would you like to know?" I asked carefully, my training in operational security making me cautious about discussing classified details even in casual conversation. "Miguel mentioned that you served with distinction in logistics operations, that you were responsible for supply lines in some of the most dangerous regions of the country. He said you received a Bronze Star for actions during a convoy operation in Helmand Province." The specificity of his knowledge surprised me. Most civilians, including my own family members, had only the vaguest understanding of what I had done during my deployments. They knew I had served overseas, knew I had been injured, but the details of my responsibilities and accomplishments had never seemed important to them, compared to the symptoms I brought home. "That's correct," I confirmed, wondering where this conversation was leading. "I commanded a battalion-level logistics unit responsible for maintaining supply lines to forward operating bases throughout the region." Judge Harrison nodded slowly, his expression growing more serious. "I'm familiar with that area of operations. In fact, I served there myself, though in a very different capacity." The revelation hit me like cold water. Judge Harrison was a veteran, which explained his understanding of military culture and his nuanced questions about my service. But something in his tone suggested there was more to his connection to Afghanistan than a simple shared deployment experience. "What unit were you with?" I asked, my curiosity overriding my usual caution about discussing military matters at social events. "I wasn't military," he replied, his voice dropping to a level that required me to lean forward to hear him clearly. "I was a civilian attorney, part of a joint task force investigating corruption in reconstruction contracts. My team was embedded with various military units throughout Helmand and Kandahar provinces during 2010 and 2011. 2010 and 2011. The timeline aligned perfectly with my final deployment, the tour that had resulted in my Bronze Star and my traumatic brain injury, and the invisible wounds that had ultimately cost me my family's acceptance. A chill ran down my spine as I began to understand where this conversation might be heading. "Judge Harrison," I said slowly, my voice barely above a whisper. "What was the name of your task force?" "Joint Legal Advisory Team 7, he replied, watching my face carefully for signs of recognition. We worked primarily with logistics units, investigating irregularities in supply chain management and contractor oversight. The words triggered a flood of memories so vivid they made my hands shake. Joint Legal Advisory Team 7. I remembered them, remembered the civilian lawyers who had embedded with my unit during some of the most dangerous months of my deployment. They had been investigating fraud in reconstruction contracts, corruption that was costing American taxpayers millions of dollars while putting soldiers' lives at risk. You were with the team that investigated the medical supply contracts, I said, the pieces clicking into place with shocking clarity. The ones where contractors were delivering expired medications and faulty equipment to forward operating bases. Judge Harrison's expression confirmed what I was beginning to understand. We were. And you were the logistics commander who provided the evidence that made our investigation possible. You documented discrepancies in delivery manifests, photographed substandard equipment, preserved samples of expired medications for analysis. The memories came flooding back now, details I had pushed aside in the years since my injury. The civilian lawyers, who had asked endless questions about supply chain procedures, who had treated me as a valuable source of information rather than an obstacle to be overcome. I had spent weeks compiling documentation for their investigation, working late into the night to organize evidence that would expose the contractors who were profiting from substandard supplies while soldiers' lives hung in the balance. You saved lives with that investigation, Judge Harrison continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. The prosecution that resulted from our work shut down a network of fraudulent contractors and prevented millions of dollars in additional theft. More importantly, it ensured that soldiers in combat zones received the medical supplies and equipment they needed to survive. I stared at him across the table, struggling to process the magnitude of what he was telling me. During the darkest years of my exile from family, during the months when I had questioned my own worth and wondered if I truly was as damaged and dangerous as my relatives believed, the work I had done in Afghanistan had been making a difference in ways I had never known. I never heard what happened after you left, I admitted, my voice thick with emotion I was struggling to control. I was injured a few weeks after your team departed, and by the time I recovered enough to ask questions, no one seemed to know anything about the investigation. That's not uncommon, Judge Harrison replied gently. Security protocols often prevent information from flowing back to the sources who made investigations possible. But I can tell you that your work was instrumental in one of the largest corruption prosecutions in military contracting history. The conversation was interrupted by the approach of a waiter offering coffee and dessert, but I barely noticed the interruption. My world had shifted fundamentally in the space of a few minutes. The narrative I carried about my own worth and contributions rewritten by information I had never possessed. Judge Harrison waited until the waiter moved away before continuing. Elena, I've presided over thousands of cases in my career, but I've never forgotten the meticulous documentation and unwavering integrity you demonstrated during that investigation. When Miguel mentioned your name earlier this evening, I couldn't believe the coincidence. What happened next would transform not just my understanding of my own story, but the way my family saw me for the first time in years. The revelation about my role in Judge Harrison's investigation had left me reeling, struggling to process information that recontextualized years of self-doubt and family rejection. But before I could fully absorb what he had told me, the evening took another unexpected turn. The band had finished their set and was taking a break, leaving the ballroom filled with the comfortable buzz of conversation and the gentle clink of coffee cups against saucers. Judge Harrison excused himself again, this time walking purposefully toward the head table, where Miguel and Sophia were greeting guests who approached to offer final congratulations. I watched as he spoke briefly with my nephew, their conversation animated but too distant for me to overhear. Miguel's expression shifted from polite attention to surprise, then to something that looked like excitement as Judge Harrison continued speaking. I was so focused on their interaction that I almost didn't notice when my mother approached table 12. She moved slowly across the ballroom, her steps careful and deliberate, wearing the same expression of determined resolve that I remembered from childhood when she was about to address a difficult situation. The other guests at our table seemed to sense the significance of the moment, their conversations trailing off as she drew closer. Elena, she said when she reached my chair, her voice formal but not unkind, may I speak with you privately? The request sent a spike of anxiety through my chest, triggering all the old fears about confrontation and rejection that had shaped my response to family interactions for years. But there was something different in her manner, a hesitancy that suggested she was as nervous about this conversation as I was. I followed her away from the main reception area to a quiet alcove overlooking the golf course, where floor-to-ceiling windows provided a view of the manicured grounds bathed in the soft light of early evening. For a long moment we stood in awkward silence, two women who had once shared an unbreakable bond but who had become strangers to each other over the course of 3 painful years. "You look well," she said finally, her voice carrying a note of surprise that I found both comforting and insulting. Had she expected me to have deteriorated completely in our time apart? Had the narrative about my instability been so complete that she was shocked to see me functioning normally at a social event? "Thank you," I replied carefully, unsure of where this conversation was heading or what response she was looking for. "The ceremony was beautiful. Sophia seems lovely." My mother nodded, but I could see she was struggling with something more significant than small talk about the wedding. Her hands moved restlessly against her purse, and she kept glancing back toward the ballroom as if she was afraid of being overheard or interrupted. "Elena, there's something I need to tell you," she said eventually, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "About what happened 3 years ago. About the decision we made. To ask you to step away from the family." The words hit me like a physical blow, bringing back all the pain and confusion of that terrible night when my entire family had gathered to tell me I was too dangerous to be around their children. I had spent years in therapy processing that rejection, learning to build a life that didn't depend on their approval or acceptance. I wasn't sure I was ready to revisit those wounds, especially not at my nephew's wedding reception. "Mama, you don't need to," I started, but she held up her hand to stop me. "Yes, I do," she said firmly, some of the steel returning to her voice that I remembered from childhood. "I do need to say this, because what we did was wrong, and you deserve to know why it happened." I braced myself for another recitation of my symptoms and behaviors, another explanation of how my presence had made everyone uncomfortable and worried about their safety. But what she said next was completely unexpected. "We were scared," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly on the words. "Not of you, Mija, but for you. After you came home from your last deployment, you were so different, so hurt, and we didn't know how to help you. Every time we tried to talk to you about getting treatment, you would shut down or change the subject." I stared at her, struggling to process this new version of events. "But you said I was unstable, that I might hurt someone." "We never said that," she interrupted, her eyes filling with tears. "That was never what we believed. But Dr. Mendoza, the psychiatrist Carlos found, said that sometimes families had to take drastic action to force veterans to accept treatment. He said that if we enabled your isolation and avoidance, we were actually making your condition worse." Dr. Mendoza. I vaguely remembered Carlos mentioning a psychiatric consultant he had found, someone who specialized in military trauma and family interventions. But I had been so focused on defending myself against what felt like an attack that I hadn't paid attention to the supposed expertise behind their actions. He told us that cutting off family support was sometimes the only way to create enough crisis to motivate treatment compliance. My mother continued, the words tumbling out now as if she had been holding them back for years. "He said it would be temporary, that once you got help, we could rebuild our relationship on a healthier foundation." The revelation was staggering. My family hadn't rejected me because they thought I was dangerous or because they were ashamed of my military service. They had exiled me because a mental health professional had convinced them it was therapeutic, that abandoning me was actually an act of love disguised as tough love. "But it's been 3 years, I said, my voice hollow with the magnitude of what I was learning. "If this was supposed to be temporary, why didn't anyone reach out when I did get treatment?" My mother's face crumpled with guilt and regret. "Because by then, too much time had passed, and we didn't know how to undo what we had done. We were all so ashamed of how we had handled everything, so afraid that you would never forgive us. And Dr. Mendoza said that contacting you before you were fully stabilized could undo all the progress you had made." I felt the ground shifting beneath my feet as I tried to reconcile this new information with the narrative I had carried for 3 years. My family hadn't abandoned me out of fear or disgust. They had been manipulated by a mental health professional who had convinced them that rejection was treatment, that love sometimes required cruelty. "Maria wanted to call you so many times," my mother continued through her tears, "especially after we heard about the work you were doing with other veterans. And Carlos has been talking about reaching out ever since he saw an article about you in the Veterans newsletter. But we were all too proud and too scared to admit we had made such a terrible mistake." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of Judge Harrison, who had been looking for us throughout the reception venue. He walked toward our alcove with the measured pace of someone who understood he was intruding on a private moment, but had something important to say that couldn't wait. "I apologize for interrupting," he said when he reached us, his voice carrying the formal courtesy of his professional demeanor. "But there's something I need to share with both of you, something that can't wait until a more convenient time." My mother looked confused by the interruption, clearly wondering why a stranger was inserting himself into our family conversation. But I could see in Judge Harrison's expression that whatever he wanted to say was connected to the revelations about my service in Afghanistan, part of a larger story that was still unfolding. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said, addressing my mother with the same respectful tone he had used with me throughout the evening, "my name is Robert Harrison. I'm a federal judge, and I had the privilege of working with your daughter during her deployment to Afghanistan in 2011. My mother's eyes widened as she processed this information, clearly struggling to understand how a federal judge had come to know me and why he was approaching us at her grandson's wedding reception. "Elena probably hasn't told you about this because most of the details were classified at the time," Judge Harrison continued, his voice taking on the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to commanding attention in courtrooms. "But I want you to know that your daughter's work during that deployment resulted in one of the most significant corruption prosecutions in military contracting history." He spent the next 10 minutes explaining the investigation, the fraudulent contractors, the substandard medical supplies that were putting soldiers' lives at risk. He described my role in meticulous detail, emphasizing the courage it had taken to document evidence while under enemy fire, the integrity I had demonstrated in refusing to ignore corruption, even when it would have been easier to look the other way. "Elena's work didn't just save money for American taxpayers," he concluded, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "It saved lives. Soldiers who might have died from infected wounds because of expired antibiotics, who might have bled to death because of faulty tourniquets, who might have suffocated because of defective gas masks. They lived because your daughter had the courage to document what was happening and the integrity to demand accountability." My mother stood frozen throughout his explanation, her face cycling through expressions of shock, pride, and what looked like dawning horror as she began to understand the magnitude of what my family had failed to recognize about my service. When Judge Harrison finished speaking, she turned to look at me with eyes that held a mixture of awe and shame. "Misha," she whispered, her voice broken with emotion. "We never knew. You never told us." "I couldn't," I replied, my own voice thick with years of accumulated pain. "It was classified, and even after the investigation was over, I was dealing with my injury and the symptoms that came with it. And by then, you had already decided I was too damaged to be trusted around the family." Judge Harrison watched this exchange with the careful attention of someone who understood he was witnessing a moment of profound importance, a family reckoning that had been years in the making. When my mother and I fell silent, he spoke again with the deliberate precision of someone choosing his words very carefully. "There's one more thing you should know," he said, looking directly at my mother. "The documentation your daughter provided, the evidence she risked her life to collect, it didn't just result in prosecutions. It led to systematic changes in military contracting procedures that are still protecting soldiers today, more than a decade later." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle before delivering what felt like a final verdict on my worth and service. "Your daughter is a hero, Mrs. Rodriguez, not just because she served her country with distinction, but because she had the moral courage to fight corruption even when it put her own safety at risk. The fact that she's struggled with invisible wounds since coming home doesn't diminish her service. It makes her sacrifice even more meaningful. What happened next would change everything between my family and me, but not in any way I could have predicted." The moments that followed Judge Harrison's declaration felt suspended in time, as if the entire universe had paused to allow the weight of his words to settle into the space between my mother and me. She stood perfectly still, her face cycling through emotions I hadn't seen there in years: pride, regret, recognition, and something that looked like the dawning realization of a terrible mistake that could never be fully undone. But before either of us could speak, the quiet of our alcove was shattered by the sound of approaching footsteps. Maria appeared at the entrance, her face flushed and anxious, followed closely by Carlos and several other family members who seemed to have been searching for us throughout the reception venue. The intimate moment of potential reconciliation between my mother and me suddenly became a family gathering, complete with all the complicated dynamics that had led to my exile in the first place. "Mama, we've been looking everywhere for you," Maria said, her eyes darting between my mother, Judge Harrison, and me as she tried to assess the situation. Miguel wanted to introduce Sophia to more of the family before they leave for their honeymoon. The irony of the statement wasn't lost on me. Miguel wanted to introduce his new wife to more of the family, but the family member standing right there apparently didn't count toward that goal. I could see the exact moment when Maria registered Judge Harrison's presence, her expression shifting from concern to confusion, as she tried to understand why a stranger was involved in what appeared to be a private family conversation. "Maria Carlos," my mother said, her voice stronger than it had been moments before, carrying the tone of authority that had made her the unquestioned matriarch of our family for decades. "This is Judge Robert Harrison. He worked with Elena during her deployment to Afghanistan." Judge Harrison stepped forward with the same formal courtesy he had shown throughout the evening, extending his hand to each of my siblings in turn. But there was something different in his demeanor now. A sense of purpose that suggested he wasn't simply making polite conversation with the family of a former colleague. "I was just explaining to your mother," he said, his voice carrying across the small space with courtroom clarity, "the nature of Elena's service during her final deployment and the significant impact her work had on military operations and soldier safety." I watched my siblings' faces as Judge Harrison repeated the story he had told my mother, describing the corruption investigation, the evidence I had gathered under enemy fire, the prosecutions that had resulted from my documentation. Maria's expression shifted from polite attention to genuine surprise, while Carlos maintained the carefully neutral face he had perfected during years of corporate meetings where showing emotion was considered weakness. "Elena never mentioned any of this," Maria said when Judge Harrison finished, her voice carrying a note of accusation that made my chest tighten with familiar anxiety. "In all the conversations we had about her service, she never said anything about investigations or prosecutions." "Because most of it was classified," Judge Harrison replied patiently, as if he was explaining legal procedure to a jury that was struggling to understand complex evidence. The details of ongoing corruption investigations couldn't be shared with family members, even after the prosecutions were complete. Elena was bound by security protocols that prevented her from discussing her work. Carlos stepped forward, his business-trained mind clearly processing the implications of what he was hearing. "Judge Harrison, you said Elena's work resulted in systematic changes to military contracting procedures. Can you be more specific about the scope and impact of those changes?" For the next 15 minutes, Judge Harrison provided a detailed explanation that sounded like expert testimony in a high-stakes trial. He described how my documentation had exposed a network of fraudulent contractors operating across multiple theaters of operation, how the prosecutions had recovered hundreds of millions of dollars in fraudulent billing, how the policy changes implemented as a result of the investigation had prevented countless additional cases of corruption. "The reforms Elena's work made possible are still protecting soldiers today," he concluded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Every piece of medical equipment, every vehicle part, every supply contract that goes through the enhanced oversight procedures we implemented, that's a direct result of her courage and integrity." My family stood in stunned silence as they absorbed this information, trying to reconcile the narrative they had constructed about me over the past 3 years with the reality of what Judge Harrison was describing. I could see them struggling to understand how they had missed something so significant about my service, how they had failed to recognize accomplishments that a federal judge was describing as historically important. "But Elena," my mother said finally, turning to face me with eyes that held a mixture of pride and confusion, Why didn't you ever tell us about any of this? Even after you came home, even when we were worried about your symptoms, you never mentioned that your struggles might be connected to such important work." The question hung in the air between us, loaded with years of miscommunication and missed opportunities for understanding. I took a deep breath, drawing on the communication skills Dr. Martinez had helped me develop through years of therapy, before attempting to explain what I had never been able to articulate during the darkest period of my reintegration. "Because when I tried to talk about my service, you only wanted to focus on my symptoms," I said, my voice steady despite the emotional weight of what I was sharing. Every conversation became about my flashbacks, or my hypervigilance, or my difficulty sleeping. No one asked about the work I had done or the missions I had completed successfully. "You only saw the damage, never the service that caused it." Maria's face flushed with what looked like shame or embarrassment. "Elena, we were worried about you. We could see you were struggling, and we didn't know how to help." "But you never asked what might help," I replied, feeling some of the anger I had suppressed for years beginning to surface. "You decided what was best for me, without ever consulting me about what I needed or wanted. You brought in Dr. Mendoza and made decisions about my treatment and my place in the family without including me in the conversation." Carlos shifted uncomfortably, his usual confidence clearly shaken by the direction the conversation was taking. Dr. Mendoza said that family intervention was sometimes necessary when veterans weren't acknowledging the severity of their conditions. "Dr. Mendoza was wrong," Judge Harrison interjected, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen countless cases involving veterans and family dynamics. "Research has consistently shown that family support is one of the most important factors in successful reintegration after military service. Isolating veterans from their support systems, regardless of the therapeutic justification, typically leads to worse outcomes rather than better ones." The conversation was interrupted by Miguel's arrival, accompanied by Sophia and what appeared to be a photographer who was documenting the final moments of their reception. My nephew looked radiant with happiness, still glowing from the celebration of his marriage, but his expression grew serious when he saw our family grouped together in the alcove with Judge Harrison. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his eyes moving between the adults who had clearly been engaged in intense conversation. "Abuela, we wanted to get some final family photos before Sophia and I head to the airport." Family photos. The request should have been simple, the kind of routine documentation that happens at every wedding reception. But given the dynamics that had just been exposed, the question of who counted as family for the purposes of photographs felt loaded with significance. I started to step back, assuming that my presence would complicate what should be a joyful moment for Miguel and Sophia. But my nephew reached out and caught my arm before I could retreat. "Tia Elena, your family too," he said firmly, his voice carrying the same determination I had heard when he defended me during his speech earlier in the evening. "I want you in the pictures." Judge Harrison watched this exchange with obvious interest, and when the photographer began arranging family members for the formal shots, he approached Miguel with a request that surprised everyone present. "Miguel, I wonder if I might have a word with you and your family before the photographs begin," he said, his tone suggesting that what he wanted to discuss was both important and time-sensitive. "There's something I'd like to do to honor Elena's service, but I want to make sure it's appropriate given the family context." Miguel nodded, clearly curious about what Judge Harrison had in mind. The rest of us gathered in a loose circle, uncertain about what was coming but sensing that whatever Judge Harrison wanted to say would be significant. Judge Harrison reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew what appeared to be a small wooden box, the kind used to present military awards or commemorative items. He held it carefully, as if the contents were precious, before beginning to speak in the formal tone he might use in his courtroom. "Elena, throughout my career I've had the privilege of working with many brave men and women who have served our country with distinction," he began, his voice carrying across the alcove and drawing the attention of nearby wedding guests, who seemed to sense they were witnessing something important. "But I've rarely encountered someone whose service had such a direct and lasting impact on the safety and welfare of their fellow soldiers." He opened the box to reveal a small flag folded with military precision, along with what appeared to be an official document bearing federal seals and signatures. "This flag flew over the federal courthouse during the trial that resulted from your investigation," he continued, his eyes meeting mine directly. "The prosecutions you made possible sent corrupt contractors to prison, and recovered hundreds of millions of dollars stolen from American taxpayers. More importantly, the reforms your work inspired have prevented countless soldiers from being injured or killed by substandard equipment. Judge Harrison stepped forward and placed the box in my hands, the weight of it feeling substantial despite its small size. Elena Rodriguez. It is my honor to present you with this flag and this citation from the United States Department of Justice, in recognition of your extraordinary service to your country and your fellow soldiers. The crowd of wedding guests had grown during his presentation, drawn by the formal tone and obvious significance of what was happening. I could see members of both Miguel's and Sophia's families watching with expressions of curiosity and respect, while my own family members stood frozen in what appeared to be shock. But Judge Harrison wasn't finished. He straightened to his full height, brought his heels together with military precision, and delivered a salute that was sharp, crisp, and absolutely perfect in its execution. Commander Rodriguez, he said, his voice ringing with authority and respect. Thank you for your service, and thank you for your sacrifice. The silence that followed was complete and profound, broken only by the distant sound of music from the main ballroom and the gentle evening breeze moving through the trees outside. I stood holding the flag and citation, tears streaming down my face, while my family finally saw me the way Judge Harrison had seen me from the moment Miguel mentioned my name. Not as a damaged veteran struggling with invisible wounds, but as a decorated soldier whose service had made a meaningful difference in the world. In that moment, surrounded by family who were finally beginning to understand who I really was, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the deep, unshakable knowledge that I belonged, that my service mattered, and that the woman who had worn the uniform with pride was still here, still standing, still worthy of love and respect. The months that followed Miguel's wedding brought changes I never could have anticipated. The conversation that began in that country club alcove continued in my mother's living room, around the same dining table where they had once told me I needed professional help. But this time, the tone was different. This time, they listened. Dr. Mendoza, it turned out, had lost his license 2 years after our intervention. His tough love approach to veteran families had been discredited by research showing the devastating effects of forced isolation on military personnel struggling with PTSD. My family had been following outdated advice from a discredited professional, but knowing that didn't erase 3 years of pain on both sides. Healing wasn't immediate or simple. Maria struggled with guilt over the years we had lost. Carlos threw himself into veteran advocacy work, as if he could somehow compensate for his role in my exile by helping other military families avoid similar mistakes. My mother, now in her 80s, began attending family therapy sessions with me, determined to understand what she had failed to see before. The flag Judge Harrison presented to me now sits on my mantelpiece, next to photos from Miguel and Sophia's first anniversary party, a gathering where I wasn't just invited, but where I helped Sophia plan the menu and decorations. Their first child, a daughter named Elena Sofia, calls me Tia Nena and climbs into my lap without fear, the way children do when they're raised to see love instead of danger. I still work with veterans, but now my family understands what that work means. They've seen the letters from soldiers' families thanking me for helping navigate disability claims. They've watched me testify before congressional committees about the need for better family support programs. They've learned that my invisible wounds don't make me broken. They make me someone who can help others find their way through similar struggles. Judge Harrison and I maintain a correspondence, two people whose paths crossed in the most unexpected way. He often sends me updates about policy changes stemming from our long-ago investigation, reminding me that service continues to matter long after the uniform comes off. Some nights, when the world grows quiet, I still hear my husband's voice reminding me that we don't fight to be remembered. We fight so that no one has to be forgotten. But now I understand that sometimes, being forgotten isn't permanent. Sometimes, recognition comes when you least expect it, from people who see past the scars to the service beneath. I am Elena Rodriguez. I served my country with honor. I survived war zones and family rejection with equal measure. And I learned that the most important battles aren't always won with weapons. Sometimes they're won with truth, patience, and the courage to keep standing even when the people who should love you most have forgotten how to see you clearly. Thank you for joining me on Elena's journey today. Her story reminds us that healing is possible, that recognition can come in unexpected moments, and that sometimes the people who've forgotten us just need help remembering who we really are. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and share it with someone who might need to hear Elena's message of hope and resilience. Every subscription helps us bring more stories of courage and redemption to light. What story would you like to hear next? Let me know in the comments below.